Hi, my name's David Vizard, and you are watching PowerTec 10. Give me a few minutes of your time, and I will give you the benefit of my over 50 years of race-winning engine building. Today's subject: big block Chevy heads in iron. My question is, are we looking at the world's best iron big block Chevy head? I'll let you decide when I've given you all the numbers on it and shown you how it was all done. Let's do a little analysis on the big block head. When it first came out, it was known as, or the engine it equipped was known as the mystery engine. And then the cylinder head became a entity named under the porcupine-headed engine. Now, porcupine, that made the nickname for this the rat motor, right? And consequently the small block Chevy became the mouse motor. So if you wondered about all that terminology, that's how it came out. But back to the technical side, what we had here was a cylinder head with canted valves and a equally, comparatively speaking, complicated valve train. And it looked like, well, who would do that for no reason at all? But the truth of the matter is, if General Motors had scaled up their best small block Chevy heads, i.e. like the current or the last of the small block Chevy heads, the PowerTec heads, they would have had a cylinder head virtually equally as good, but at a lot less money. So when we look at a big block head, it's not that technical wonder that has so often been portrayed by General Motors. But anyway, let's get back to that. How does this cylinder head fare in real life? If you can hear some background noise, it's pouring down outside. It's like the heavens have opened up. But that's not going to divert us any here. This project was a little less than usual in as much as the porting, or the prototype porting, was not done by me, it was done by one of my students. And on this particular group of students I had, who were pretty much all heavily into porting, and all but one, they ran engine companies, so they were professional. Now, ironically, the one that didn't run an engine building company was the one that got the best results, but he was very dedicated to this. Now, could there be any more flow in it than my student got, or was what he did just okay? Well, at this stage we don't know, but the point is this: all of them got very good flow figures from this EQ head, and one of them got exceptional flow figures. Maybe exceptional wasn't the right word. He got very good flow figures, and I'm sure there's more flow in these heads. I'm looking at them and I'm thinking they could go 450, maybe even 460, but it would be a lot of work to get it. So with all that, just remember, it's possible to be taught how to do this flow testing and flow development and porting, etc., etc., etc. I don't like to look at this as porting so much as cylinder head development engineering, right? So with that, let's go on. As I said, let's get the ball rolling. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the combustion chamber first and the valve seats. I'm going to emphasize the valve seats because on a big block, they're important on any engine, but a big block, they're especially important because you need to get flow right off the seat because, as I've said, a big block is one of the most undervalved engines on the face of the planet. So we have to make the valves look, as far as the engine's concerned, as big as possible. With that, let's go and look at the chambers. What you're looking at here is the combustion chamber virtually finished, and the basic pre-finishing job on the seats is done. What I did here was do a rough cut on the seats, and then using a fan-like disc wheel, I went in and blended all these curves here. You can see how they're blended in, and there's a neat entry. Now, a few points on this. These are blended in at the top, exhaust is going out. The blend is most concentrated on the bottom. This angle here is about a 35-degree angle. This valve is slightly higher than this one, so that the high efficiency off the seat of this valve does not lend itself to a reverse flow. The flow comes out of here and it goes over the top of the exhaust valve during the critical overlap phase where both valves are off the seat. So this mod, sinking this valve about 50 thousandths deeper into the head, that's about as much as you can go, than this one, makes the cam look about 10 degrees shorter, and at something like 3,000 RPM, it can be worth as much as 20 foot-pounds. Note how the chamber's cut away here. I'll do a little drawing of the surface form going down here and into the seat. Cutting this away here is very good to increase output from about 4,500 up. There is no downside to it. It actually will add the odd couple of foot-pounds up to about 4,500, then it starts to add foot-pounds big time. By the time an engine like this gets to about 7,000 RPM, that laid back there is worth about 30 to 35 horsepower. Just so that you can better understand what's going on from that last scene, I've done this drawing here. This is the plateau on the quench side of the chamber. You see how it comes down to the seat, but it doesn't join the seat straight off. There's a radius into the seat like this, so that as the gas flow, or the general flow of the exhaust products, when the piston is close to TDC, is in a near horizontal format. So it's got to go round this corner and out, hence this radius into the seat. On the other side of the chamber, we have this form. This is the spark plug about where the arrowhead is, and this is the form here. We don't want this to be too efficient because it'll separate here and it will cause that reverse flow, right? After that, underneath the seats, we have a form which gives the initial opening area, or it maximizes it, and that's what I call an area ruled exhaust port. This is also something that is not generally talked about, and I don't think it's much known except in any field other than maybe Formula One. So why does laying back the chamber like this work? On big blocks, two reasons. One, if the chamber is too close here, and shrouds this slightly, this can be the most efficient side for flow just here. And what happens is it gets around the corner here, but it's going too fast to make it round the short side turn. And what happens is, when we test on the flow bench, and the same happens on the engine obviously, there's a big reversion of flow on the floor of the port. It has been a problem with big block ports for years. If you've ever seen some of these fancy shaped ports, that's an effort to cure it. The problem lies not in the port, it's the chamber here. right? The second reason is when the piston comes up and we have this mighty quench punch here, we don't want the gases going over the top of the exhaust valve. We want them to come round here. This will be rounded off here after the head skimmed. Round here and go underneath the valve and reinforce the flow out of this side. That is the major contributor towards stopping reversion. So that cutout there not only makes the engine run better at low RPM, but it really helps at the top end. It's going to add 500 RPM to the useful range on a 700 horsepower engine, plus about 30 to 35 horsepower, as I said just now. There's many ways to form a seat with the radii before and after the actual seat itself. The most expensive way of doing it is like the cut car guys, or some of them do, is to cut their seats on a Neuen computer controlled machine. Now they don't necessarily use a radius before and after or whatever, they use their own designs. However, I also have got the Goodson 3D system, and I have form cutters that I can cut a radius on the seat. But to be honest, the fastest way to do it, and you can do this at home if you're careful with your grinder, is to do it with a flap wheel. But you have to modify the flap wheel like this. Here's a close-up of the flap wheel I use for big block size valves. It's a 3-inch disc, and I cut sections out of it like this. Now what can happen is you can now crunch it up like that, put it in the hole. Here is what happens when you power it up. This is when centrifugal force on these here works in your favor. Here's what happens when we apply this tool into the throat of the valve, right? Ready? Here we go. You'll see that it catches it at the top and at the bottom. The area where it's got the sharpest corners, it removes metal first. The actual seat itself that was cut here is where the least amount of metal is removed by this process. So, although it looks pretty vicious on the seat, it's not as bad as it looks. However, it's not something that's a slam dunk. You do need to experiment with this on a used scrap cylinder head. What we see here is the seat. It is the right OD and slightly undersized on the ID. I cut them like this because when I go in there to polish them, I take the edges off the inside of the seat, but not so much on the outside. So they'll come out the right size, which is about 50 thousandths wide for the intake. Looking at the chamber here, we see some very relevant things. Firstly, you'll notice that this is all cut away here compared with the stock one, or a typical big block Chevy head. There's a good reason for that. During the piston reaching TDC on the exhaust stroke, normally the gases, the quench area would come right to here. The gases go over the top of the exhaust valve, and they do so with a great deal of velocity. So what happens is it excites this side of the valve, but it starves this side. The gases go out here and they're traveling at high velocity, and they don't make it round the turn, and they tend to block off the port on this side here, and we get a reversion on the bottom of the port. So cutting the chamber like this alleviates that. Now after this head has been milled off, this area here will be rounded off, this edge here, so that it provides a nice smooth transition into this slope here, so that those exhaust gases go out of the exhaust port and they energize this side of the port, and it fixes the reversion. That's something you won't find on any other video. Let's look at a couple of other things. Firstly, no, well, not firstly, but a point here. This side of the exhaust valve is slightly shrouded, and that's intended, because otherwise it will exaggerate the flow here and develop the reverse flow. Now, if you look at this very carefully, you'll find that the exhaust is actually in a slight pocket, and that there's a nice radius leading up to the seat all around. Again, that's so that during the overlap period, the gases can travel out the exhaust port easier. Now this causes a spike in vacuum generated to suck the charge in, intake charge. So what happens is we get rid of the exhaust more efficiently, and we get the intake charge started more effectively. Now have a look at the valves here. You'll notice there's a sharp edge here. That's intentional. We don't want the gases coming in here and out there, right? There's a 35-degree top cut on all of this here, 45-degree seat, and a nice radius coming out of it. So nothing conventional there, just good workmanship. Here, this is very carefully de-shrouded. Now if you look carefully, you'll see a light shining here. There is a slight valley going up here, because the gases don't come out like that. They come out, and the gases here have to turn. So the ones coming out here have to turn, right? So there's a general trend of the mixture to be going out and around like that. We need to exaggerate that trend, right? So that's that there. Very little has had to come out, because this original cylinder head was very well designed in terms of porting to start with. A few things about big blocks and big block heads in general that you should know and probably don't appreciate. First off, looking at that, the biggest valve you can get into a 454 or bigger cylinder head, then it looks pretty big for the job. So you're probably going to be surprised when I tell you that a big block Chevy is one of the most undervalved engines on the face of the planet. If we had a valve in, let's compare a 350 Chevy, small block Chevy, with a 454 big block Chevy. If we had proportionately sized valves, the 202 valve in the small block Chevy, to get the equivalent of that, we'd have to have a 2.7 inch valve in the big block Chevy. Well, no one uses a 2.7 inch valve. You just can't get it in. So this makes it very important to have a very efficient valve, because we need, the biggest we can get in is about 2.3. We can fudge in bigger ones, but not as a direct replacement. 2.3, we have to make that valve as efficient as possible so that the engine thinks it's got a bigger valve. So valve seats become very important. Secondly, although the valves are canted, you'll notice that the ports are still very flat compared with the axis of the valve. So it's important that we shape the ports so that they in themselves are efficient, not just big. We can always get flow by making big ports. That loses velocity, we lose energy in the port, and consequently we lose the potential of making horsepower and torque. Now then, let's consider this. In a nutshell, what we've got is an engine capable of a lot of cubic inches, but not very capable in terms of cylinder heads for those cubes. Anything over about 360 cubes doesn't have enough intake valve. Surprising. So Modifying big block cylinder heads to get good results can be a very beneficial thing. Unfortunately, big block Chevy heads are not the easiest to modify in terms of where the air is going. I'm going to give you a lot of tips here when we look at these cylinder heads here, these EQ heads, and we'll go from there. Okay, here we have a shot down the intake port. This is the bad port. That's the one that runs into the cylinder wall. Now look in the back there and you'll see a shadow that goes across like this. From that you can see that the air is not trying to go in straight in like this. It's trying to sweep across the cylinder wall and chamber face, which is where it wants to go. So this is something that you have to build in. Note that the trailing edge of the guide boss or the tail is off at an angle. Also, this corner here and on in and round there is critical. What you need to do is to widen this area here as much as possible. As it goes in, it needs to sink a bit so that the air slows up progressively so that it can make it round this corner. Also, it exposes this side of the port, and consequently it gets this side working much better. That does two things. One, it flows more air, and two, and this is important, it generates a lot of swirl. What we have here is the good port. I'm showing you this angle because I want you to see this hole in the wall here. That goes into the bolt hole here. When the bolt's in, it seals it up. That should be a good reference point for you to figure out whether you've got the port wide enough. Why widen it down there? Because that's where the majority of the flow wants to go. Also, now I'm going to move the camera here. Take a look down the throat of the port to the guide boss. You'll see that the trailing edge of the guide boss is almost in line with the front of the guide boss, and that's because this port is already aimed towards the center of the cylinder. Again, like the other port, I'm just going to move the camera here, so hang on just a moment. This area here is very important. That side of the valve is shrouded by the fact that the port's aimed this, biased this way instead of sufficiently that way. So like the other port, this area here is very important. It's very touchy. Get that right and you'll get those flow numbers. Here's a look down the exhaust port. On a big block, all the exhaust ports are symmetrical. That means they're all the same for every cylinder. If you look carefully, you'll see that the lead-in part of the guide, and it is the lead-in because the exhaust is coming out, going the opposite way to the intake, is off at a slight angle. And we have a bulge in the port here. That's because the gases want to go out at an angle like this from the center of the cylinder. So we let the gases go as far as we can where they want to go, not where we try and dictate they should go. Mother Nature is not our slave, so we have to go with whatever works here, and that is to take care of the rudimentary principles of porting. Let the air go as far as possible where it wants to go. You'll get the most flow out of the port that way. Port's not big. The chamber mod we've done has prevented the reversion that takes place in this area here. And I'll give you some figures here. Some of the heads I've flowed, when the exhaust is coming, or the air on the flow bench is coming out of here at 320 feet a second, It's going in here at 300. Goes in, tumbles like this, and then comes back out here. Is it any wonder it kills the flow? So, we've done all of our flow testing. Now let's take a look at the results. What I did here was I compared this EQ iron head with one of my ported sets of AFR 338 heads. Now these AFR heads are real powerhouses, right? On a 556 I've seen just over 1,000 horsepower. So they will go there, and that was not a super trick double throwdown deal. It was something that, well, you'd need a kind of a budget for it, but nothing outstanding. Anyway, don't have figures for the iron head, but the reason I checked out this head was because I had several engine builder friends of mine who are very reputable engine builders call me up and say, had I tried it? No, David hasn't tried it yet. Well, have now. At least the flow testing, not the dyno bit. So I'm going on their say-so that these heads will make big horsepower. They've talked about 800 plus horsepower for a street motor. That's on a 555 or maybe a 540. I can't remember, but anyway, really good results. But first, why would we use an iron head? Right, difficult to repair if you drop a valve. In fact, they're scrap, but they're pretty tough. The reason that you would go with an iron head is for marine use, where corrosion might be a factor that needs to be taken into account. So if you want a pair of cylinder heads for a big block that's for a boat that's got to have torque right off low speed, then this could be the head for you, or heads for you. Also, if you've got a big truck, having 50 pounds of extra weight up front is neither here nor there. But having another 30 or 40 foot-pounds of torque down low is. So there's your reasons for using it. Also, cost. As it happens, the heads we're doing here are going to go into an S10 street strip car, right? They're going to be moving everything to the back of the car to make up for that 50 or 60 pounds of extra weight. Anyway, let's look at the results. The thin line here is the AFR heads, intake, exhaust, and this is the port velocity. What I need to do first is to go and look at the let's talk about port velocity, right? As quantified by this program, this is my AOP program for cylinder heads, we know for a fact that to make sure we get the best of the torque and output over as wide a range as possible, we want to have a port which is up in the 300 feet per second range. Well, that means we'd have to lift the valve 800. A little too much for a daily driver. 700 though is not out of the question, and up here we're still doing okay at around about 270 CFM. It's okay, it's not the best, but this is big block territory for you. Big blocks, to get the flow you have to have the port a little larger than would necessarily be the case. Problem, port velocity is low. If it's too low, torque suffers, right? Now look at this. At 700 lift, we are very close to 300 for our EQ head. That's very good. As far as exhaust goes, it's better than the AFR head, at least the way I ported them, right? Don't forget, this AFR head here did make big power. Let's now take a look at the flow. That's CFM flow, we go there, calculate. Right, here is the flow curves. You can see from 300 on up, the EQ heads, the way my student ported them to my instructions as per dished out when he was in class in our cylinder head porting school, right? They are better from here on up. Oh, by the way, all of my students got good results with these heads. This guy got the best results, right? So this is nothing, the skill of doing that is nothing to do with me. My skill was in teaching the guy how to do it. There's the AFR one. You can see top end, they made almost the same. Looking at the exhaust flow, for all practical purposes, they were identical. Now, let's have a look at one more factor here that is not generally shown. And that's port energy. For a big block Chevy, or for any engine, but especially for a big block Chevy, this is very important. If you do not have enough port energy, that is enough mass flowing at high enough speed, you do not make the most of the ramming effect that is possible to have. And a big block Chevy, because it's undervalved, is very susceptible to losing out if it doesn't have enough port energy. Well, here's the port energy for our EQ head compared with the port energy for the AFR head. And remember, the AFR head was a killer. So what conclusions can we come to here? Based on this and the tests done by some of my friends who are among them NASCAR engine builders, they've had very good results with this cylinder head, right? This all shows why. If you want to port cylinder heads like this, I do run a school to teach you how to do it. In closing, I'd like to make a few points about using these heads successfully, or any big block head. Firstly, no successful engine is the result of one trick part. It doesn't matter how good these cylinder heads flow. If they're not used with the appropriate spec on the rest of the engine, they will fail. Well, they won't fail, you will fail. Let's look at our big block deal here. We've already said it's undervalved. This means that it's very important that we not only open the valve as quickly as possible, not easy on a big block, it has a heavy valve train, but also we need to open it to the area where the flow regime is the best possible we can get. This means that with these EQ heads, you should not use anything less than 650 lift, preferably about 700. If it's not a high mileage motor you're dealing with, then maybe 750 or even the lofty goal of 800 for a street strip deal. And that's about it. Now, if it's just a race only thing, a 1-inch lift would be perfect. Not practical for the road though. Now, the other thing is it's no good having all the flow in the world if the valves are opened and closed at the wrong time, right? And let me make a point here, since we are just about to hit the subject of camshafts. The wrong cam will cost you just as much as the right one. In fact, more, because if you realize you've got the wrong cam, you've got to buy another one, right? Now, for any of the vehicles that we're likely to be dealing with, that is between compressions between about 9 and maybe a max of about 11 to 1, right? We are going to need a camshaft that is a pretty tight lobe centerline angle. These 112, 114 lobe centerline angle cams will not cut it. Now, they're not just a little bit off. You are going to lose 60 or 70 horsepower and probably as much as 80 foot-pounds of torque. Don't believe me? Go ahead and try it, right? What you need to do is to call Walters Engines, Terry Walters up in Roanoke, and get a cam spec'd to your big block specification. This cam will take into account everything that is needed to on that motor, and I personally will spec that cam out for you using my Torque Master program. It's deadly accurate and it gets results. What else? Oh, well, still on the valve train bit, you'll need to take care of the valve train by having the best springs possible. That is, springs with a high resonant frequency. That means buying a good spring. That means buying one that's expensive and probably low mass. Well, almost certainly low mass, so that it doesn't run into surges easy. Doing that, you'll need less load on the valve, and consequently the valve train will be more reliable, and you'll be able to lift the cam, lift the valves higher. As far as intake is concerned, a good single plane manifold is best. Here I would recommend a Sniper Junior, preferably with a Dominator on it, but it can work very well with a good 4150 carburetor in the 1000 CFM range. If you're going to use a two-plane, be aware that there is a problem. The two-plane manifolds, especially from metal block, the runners on them flow very well, but the carburetors they're built for don't. So a lot of the flow capability of this or any big block cylinder head is compromised by that very issue. With that, I think I've got to about the end of what I want to talk about here. Oh, well, there is one other thing. If you want to know more about big blocks, I do have a best-selling big block book from PowerTec. It's got stuff in it that you can't get from any pro engine builders, right? Not unless they've read the book and they're just quoting me. Right, now I know that sounds kind of arrogant, but the fact of the matter is, that is the real world case. Thank you for watching.